Welcome back. We are in week 9. Thanks so much for sticking through us. The Old Testament is huge, and believe it or not, so much more could be said. But you are sticking with it. Today we're going to look at the book of Esther and Ezra-Nehemiah. Esther is about the preservation of God's kingdom people and how this gives hope for the coming Messiah. The book of Esther details how God preserved his kingdom people through whom the Messiah would ultimately come. This figure, Mordecai, gains victory over Haman, and that victory foreshadows the greater victory that the Messiah would secure over his people. In this book, God's name is never mentioned, and yet he is behind the scenes working always. Let's pray to him. Oh God, sometimes it feels like you are distant, but you have promised to ever be near. This book reminds us of that. Comfort and encourage weary hearts today through this book of kingdom hope. Amen. Here's the overview of the book of Esther. The setting for God's providential preservation of his people is that Esther replaces Vashti as queen in chapters 1:1 through 2:18. Then we have the experience of God's providential preservation of his people as Mordecai replaces Haman in 2:19 all the way up to 9:32. And then there's a brief 3-verse epilogue that honors Mordecai, declaring that Mordecai would prosper, being second in command over the Persian Empire. Just like Joseph and just like Daniel, we will have a foreigner, a Jew who's now ruling in a foreign land. Let's walk through this book. The setting of God's providential preservation of his people, Esther replaces Vashti. So right off the bat, and I'm just going to walk through overviewing the major contents. The king only appears to have authority when really he doesn't. This king, Persian King Ahasuerus, holds a great feast for his princes in the first 9 verses. And Vashti has a separate banquet. Now the king calls in his beautiful wife and wants her to flaunt her beauty, and yet she refuses to do this, and it greatly disrespects Ahasuerus. So after some counsel, Ahasuerus sends out an edict throughout all the land that the wives must honor their husbands. He has to declare it as a command because it's not happening in his own home. And so it is that a new queen is going to come to Persia. Chapters 2:1 through 18 overviews how Ahasuerus then seeks out a new wife to replace Vashti. And it's here that we learn the story of our main characters. There is a certain Mordecai who is a Benjamite who's raising his orphaned cousin Hadassah, who's also known as Esther. Now, in the midst of trying to figure out who the queen will be, Esther is taken into the palace. She becomes part of the king's harem, and ultimately he chooses her as queen. And all the kingdom celebrates. Now, it's at this point that the story really picks up, and we experience God's providential preservation of his people. He is there, even though his name and his title as God or Yahweh are never used in the book. And it's at this point that Mordecai really rises to the fore. There's a plot against the king and a plot against the Jews. Mordecai is hanging out at the gate, and he is Esther's guardian. So he's always there wanting to make sure that she, the new queen, is being cared for. And in the process, he hears about a coup for killing the king. And so he saves Ahasuerus' life by telling Esther of the plot that someone wants to destroy him. Well, Ahasuerus then ends up promoting Haman, the enemy of the Jews, and Haman, in turn, seeks through a legal recourse to exterminate the Jews because Mordecai, who hangs out at the gate, is unwilling to bow down to Haman. So you have these major figures: Ahasuerus the king, Haman the villain, Esther the queen, and Mordecai the Jew. Now, it's into this context of Haman wanting to destroy the Jews that Mordecai finds out about the plot, and he tells Esther. And now Esther is called to bravely intercede as the queen as Haman continues to plot. Mordecai encourages Esther to go in to the king, believing that she has been raised up into her royal position for such a time as this. And it's at this point that we read such a foundational verse in the book. Look with me there in Esther chapter 4, verse 14. We read Esther 4:14. If you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will indeed rise for the Jews from another place. Oh, the confidence of this man in his God. But you, Esther, and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. Now, Esther then determines to work. She invites the king and Haman to a banquet. They have their first banquet, and she requests in this context that they attend a second banquet. Now, Haman is proud. He's so excited, having no clue who Esther actually is, but also knowing that Mordecai is an evil villain. That's what he thinks. Mordecai won't bow down to him. Mordecai won't pay him honor. And so he continues to work his plot against the Jews, and he decides to build a tree upon which he determines to hang Mordecai. Now, in the process, Esther has invited the king to a new banquet, and he has a dream in the night that recalls when Mordecai saved him from being killed. And he wonders, has anybody ever honored Mordecai? The servants say no. So the next morning, after the banquet and after the tree, the gallows have been built, Haman comes into the king's presence and he says, what should we do for the one that the king honors? And Haman thinks it's him. Oh, let him walk through the land and on the king's horse and let people say, this is what's done for the one the king wants to honor. And so the king honors Mordecai, and it humiliates Haman because he has to walk Mordecai through the land saying, this is what's done for the one the king wants to honor. So in the midst of this now, the king forces Haman to honor the very one he hates. He forces Haman to honor Mordecai because Mordecai saved the king's life. And Haman hates this. He's got to walk through the land, leading Mordecai on the horse, declaring, this is what happens to the one the king wants to honor. And when Haman's wife hears of it, she knows Haman's end is coming. Well, that night, Esther has her second banquet, and it's here that she reveals to Ahasuerus Haman's plot. She says, oh yes, I am of Jewish ethnicity, and Haman wants to kill all my people. Well, the king promptly orders that Haman be hung on the very tree, on the very stake that he had built for Mordecai. Well, in the process, the king allows a new order to go through the land, that in the very day that Haman wanted to kill all the Jews, that the Jews could in turn defend themselves to defeat their enemies. Ahasuerus promotes Mordecai over Haman's house. And then Esther and Mordecai petition Ahasuerus to pass legislation that the Jews could defend themselves, and this is exactly what they do. Mordecai leads the Jews to defeat their enemies, and in the midst of this, Esther petitions the king to allow the Jews an additional day for the Jews to defeat their enemies in Susa. So they do this. Now there is this 2-day reality of deliverance that the end of the book tells us becomes the Feast of Purim. Mordecai establishes a new feast for all the Jews in the land, that they should celebrate in perpetuity this great deliverance that God has brought over the villainous, serpent-like Haman in giving Israel freedom. So then the epilogue comes, and Mordecai is honored. We're told that he prospers, and it becomes second in command over the entire Persian Empire. So the lasting message of Esther, God, whose title and name is never even found in this book, is nevertheless ever present and will indeed preserve his own all the way to the end. It's this God who will also punish the very wicked who stand against God's people. Mordecai is portrayed as the ideal Saul who succeeds where Saul failed. Saul the Benjamite and son of Kish failed to kill Agag, king of the Amalekites. Now Haman the Agagite is overcome by Mordecai the Benjamite and son of Kish. Mordecai is the instrument that brings the end to the Agagites. He does what Saul should have done, and in doing so, he portrays the victory that the Messiah would ultimately have over the enemies of God. Mordecai's victory over Haman foreshadows the coming of the Messiah's victory over all serpent-like beastly kingdoms of mankind. Now, the Messiah is in the line of Judah. He's not in the line of Benjamin. And therefore, Mordecai, in the line of Benjamin, a Saul figure, anticipates a greater son of David now who will come after him. So I summarize this book. God discreetly and sovereignly preserves his people from Haman's extermination by honoring Esther over Queen Vashti and by honoring Mordecai over Haman, which results in his people's joy in order to foreshadow the Messiah's work at the end of the age. How about the book of Ezra, Nehemiah? This is a book about the restoration of God's kingdom people and the land. Before the days of Ezra, Cyrus, the king of Persia, had issued long ago a decree that allowed the Israelites to return to the promised land and rebuild Jerusalem and the temple. After overviewing the first wave of returnees who rebuilt the temple, Ezra and Nehemiah were the key figures who led the second and third waves of the returnees to revive the faithless people and to restore the city, respectively. So what these key figures, Ezra and Nehemiah, are attempting to do is to do both an internal spiritual work inside the people and an external work of protection through building walls around the city that would in turn help the people truly live for God. But it also identifies that this internal work is not fully accomplished and that they truly need the Messiah to establish his kingdom. Ezra, Nehemiah, here's my overview. First, the rebuilding a broken temple in hope. That's Ezra 1 through 10. Then the rebuilding of a broken city in hope. That's Nehemiah 1 through 13. A broken temple and a broken city. Let's walk through these two main parts of this single book. Rebuilding a broken temple in hope. So, this starts with the restoration of a physical temple. Cyrus makes a decree in Ezra chapter 1, verses 2 and 3. We read about this certain Cyrus, king of Persia, and he declares, "The Lord, that is Yahweh, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth. And he's charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah." So he says, whoever is among all of his people, may his God be with him, and let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and there rebuild the house of the Lord, the God of Israel. He is the God who is in Jerusalem. That's how the book begins, with this vision of rebuilding the temple in Jerusalem. So with Joshua the high priest and Zerubbabel the governor and two key prophets, Haggai and Zechariah, close to 50,000 people returned to Jerusalem. So what do? Well, we read about it in the beginning of this book. Number one, they rebuild the altar. Chapter 3, verses 2 and 3. Then they lay the foundation of the temple, chapter 3, 10 through 11. Then finally, in chapter 6, 14 and 15, the temple is completed. But having a physical building wasn't enough. They also needed to restore the temple's faithless people in hope. So the physical temple is built, and then Ezra comes in to restore the people of the temple. And we read Ezra's memoirs in chapter 7 through 10. So, for example, read with me in chapter 7, Ezra chapter 7, verse 9. Ezra chapter 7, verse 9. We read, "On the first day of the first month, Ezra began to go up from Babylon. And on the first day of the 5th month, he came to Jerusalem." Why? For the good hand of his God was on him. Why? For Ezra set his heart to study the law of the Lord and to do it and to teach both statute and rule in Israel. So God brings Ezra, as he's seeking the Lord, all the way from Babylon to Jerusalem. And there Ezra pleads with God to pardon and show mercy to the very people of God who, though they be back in the land, still have a lot of pagan Babylon in their hearts. Look with me at chapter 9, 13 through 15. Ezra the priest prays to God. "And after all that has come upon us for our evil deeds and for our great guilt, seeing that you, our God, have punished us less than our iniquity deserved and have given us such a remnant as this, shall we now break your commandments again and intermarry with the peoples who practice all these abominations? Would you not be angry with us until you consumed us, so that there should be no remnant, nor any to escape? O Lord, the God of Israel, you are just, for we are left a remnant that has escaped, as it is this day. Behold, we are before you in our guilt, for none can stand before you because of this." Ezra is there to help try to bring the people back in alignment with their God. It's at this point that we move to the second part of the book, the rebuilding of a broken city in hope. And these are all Nehemiah's memoirs. And as in the former unit, now we first read about the rebuilding of a physical Jerusalem, Jerusalem's physical walls in hope. Notice Nehemiah's prayer up front. There's a crisis and there's a prayer in 1:3, Nehemiah 1:3. "And they said to me, the remnant there in the province who had survived the exile is in great trouble and shame. Why? The wall of Jerusalem is broken down and its gates are destroyed by fire." So Nehemiah prays, "Oh, remember the word that you commanded your servant Moses, saying, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the peoples. But if you return to me and keep my commandments and do them, though your outcasts are in the uttermost parts of heaven, from there I will gather them and bring them to the place that I have chosen to make my name dwell there." So Nehemiah travels to Jerusalem and he rebuilds the city wall. We read that in 6:15. But what is still needed is the rebuilding of Jerusalem's faithless people. And this is done in 773b all the way to 1027. What do we read? We read Ezra now back on the scene as the priest, and he leads the Levites to read from Moses' law to the people. Nehemiah chapter 8, verses 8 through 10. Nehemiah 8, 8 through 10. They read from the book, from the law of God clearly, and they gave the sense so that the people understood the reading. And Nehemiah, who was the governor, and Ezra the priest and scribe, and the Levites who taught the people, said to the people, "This day is holy to the Lord your God. Don't mourn or weep," for all the people wept as they heard the words of the law. Then he said to them, Go your way, eat the fat and drink sweet wine, and send portions to anyone who has nothing ready, for this day is holy to our Lord. And do not be grieved, for the joy of the Lord is your strength." The Levites then pray to God for help. Why? Because the people are not where they need to be. Is this the restoration? Look with me in chapter 9, 32 and 33. This is the prayer of these Levites on behalf of the people. "Now therefore, O God, the great, the mighty, and the awesome God, who keeps covenant and steadfast love, let not all the hardship seem little to you that has come upon us, upon our kings, our princes, our priests, our prophets, our fathers, indeed all your people, since the time of the kings of Assyria until this very day. Yet you have been righteous in all that has come upon us, for you have dealt faithfully, and we have acted wickedly." There was something still so horribly wrong in the hearts of these returned peoples. Chapter 10, verses 28 through 32. The Levites lead the Israelites to make new vows before God. Their hearts need to be right. They need to honor Him and follow Him. So they vow three things: to not engage in interfaith marriage, to keep the Sabbath, and then to give yearly in order to support the ministry of this newly built temple. But when we get to chapter 13, each of those three vows is systematically, continually broken by the people. They fail to support the ministry of the temple in 13, 10 through 14. They fail to keep the Sabbath in 13, 15 through 22. And then they just continue on in their interfaith marriage, allowing their hearts to be moved against the Lord, 13, 23 through 31. And therefore, Nehemiah just ends the book, "Oh God, remember me for good." This book is loaded with unfulfilled promises. Unfulfilled promises that highlight how much a greater restoration is needed. Now, my student, Brian Verrett, has helped me with this whole list. What kind of promises are we talking about? Circumcised hearts. Nehemiah's prayer for restoration in Nehemiah 1, it cites Deuteronomy, but it doesn't go so far as to remind us of God's prayer in Deuteronomy that He would circumcise hearts and generate real love. The mirror endings of Ezra and Nehemiah both speak of interfaith marriage and divorce, and therefore they show how deeply the people needed this heart transformation. Jerusalem without walls and protection. Isaiah had foreseen a day when Jerusalem would never close its gates or need protection. Why? Because hostility would have completely ceased and the nations would be part of Zion. Zechariah, too, had looked forward to the day when the new Jerusalem will be inhabited without walls due to the many people who live within it. Zechariah 2:4. And yet here, the whole goal is to build the walls around the city. We also know that God's glory in the midst of the people was supposed to be there, yet it wasn't. Unlike what we learn about in the tabernacle in Exodus 40 or the temple in 1 Kings 8, Ezra and Nehemiah, after the temple is built, never tells us that God's glory fills the second temple. What of Zechariah's promise to be the glory in her midst or to dwell in her midst? It's not there. Then, nations were supposed to join with Israel. But instead of the nations joining to Israel, Ezra and Nehemiah live in fear of them. What was supposed to happen was freedom from slavery. Instead of experience a messianic new exodus of freedom, what we read in Ezra and Nehemiah is that both of them declare Israel remains slaves. And what about the Messiah? Ezra and Nehemiah never speaks of the Messiah on the other side of Israel's exile. So what do I make of all this? Well, Ezra and Nehemiah encourages the reader to anticipate a greater return from exile. In this Exodus, God will fulfill all of his promises through the Messiah. Israel needed something better. So my summary for this book: despite God's returning his people to the land and enabling them successfully to rebuild Jerusalem's temple and its walls, Israel remains in exilic slavery and fails to faithfully obey the terms of the covenant, thus showing they had a deep need for the transforming work that the Messiah alone would bring after the exile was ultimately over.